Having wrecked a perfectly good car, we are going to cut up and remove the Kia body, make the hot rod body fit the chassis, and then remove and relocate the engine and gearbox. Here we're cutting off the unnecessary front of the chassis. With everything being moved backwards, we don't need quite so much chassis poking out the front. Because the body has such a short rear overhang, there's a lot of excess chassis that we can cut off and remove.
We need to get the body sitting flat so we know where we can put everything. We need to slide the engine and the gearbox back because currently there's big space there. We also need to work out where all the steering and all the stuff is going to go.
Funnily enough, 32 Ford body is not designed to fit on a Kia chassis, so we're having to cut a lot of the fibreglass off that would normally locate it on a 32 Ford pattern frame. As you can see here, we're just using an angle grinder to just cut away what we need to get the clearance we require. The body mounts don't quite sit flat with the frame and the chassis, so we're going to cut those off to get the fiberglass body to sit flat. As you can see, cutting the body mounts was taking some time. So unlike a popular Celica powered mini YouTube series, we're going to get the punk out. As we're going to be cutting and welding when we move the engine mounts and gearbox cross member, now seemed like a good time to remove the fuel tank. Removing the fuel tank also gives us a bit more space as the top of it contacts the body shaft.
In order to get the engine and gearbox out later, we need to take out the rear drive shaft, so that's what we're doing now. the engine is still attached to the chassis, so we need to undo a few bolts and hopefully we can lift it out.
So with the engine and gearbox out, we can now get rid of some extra dead weight, which comes in the form of the front differential and drive shafts. The bolts were fairly well seized, as you can see here. We're having to use a bit of scaffold tube to get some more leverage on the ratchet. Having undone the mounts for the front diff, we were hoping we'd be able to just drop it out from underneath. We tried all sorts of different wiggling techniques to try and get it to drop through the gap between the cross members, but there just wasn't enough space. So in the end we decided to deploy the impact spanners and a small hammer. We're taking off one side of the differential housing, hoping that we can separate it into two smaller pieces that will fit through the gap between the cross members. once we'd separated the diff into two halves, we found there still wasn't enough room to get it out. So we had to separate the upper ball joint to allow us to move the front drive shaft over enough to separate the splines on the CV joint to be able to remove it. With the diff out of the way, we can now remove the front drive shafts. They were, as you can see, well rusted in there and required a little bit of persuasion. Here we're marking the chassis with duct tape so we know where the front of the body sits to give us a reference line for when we move the engine back. We will be moving the engine without having the body on, so we're using that tape as a guideline and then this tape marked to make sure we get the body back on in the right place every time.
So I'm going to work on removing the where the gearbox mats the chassis and undo the power steering lines.
With the engine and gearbox located where we want them, we're now starting to make the new gearbox crossmember. We're cutting up the old crossmember to reuse the mount location, and then attaching some new box section on the outside so that it locates in the new position.
So what we've been doing is making a cross member for the gearbox to mount to, which Tom has welded onto the chassis now, and the gearbox is bolted to it. So the next thing to do will be to sort out getting the engine mounts welded to the chassis.